I recently came upon a video where William Lane Craig and Ben Shapiro apparently debunked the top atheist arguments. This got me curious. Did they do it? Should I stop being an atheist because it doesn't make sense anymore? I guess we'll find out. I woke up sick today, so my voice might be rough, but I'm just going to do my best to blow through this. Hopefully you can tolerate what I sound like and a few more voice noises than usual, and also tolerate Craig and Shapiro at the same time. Because, wow, both of them on screen at once is a lot of their kind of energy to take in.
Let's talk about a couple of those philosophy arguments from 101 that are constantly trotted out. I've had similar experiences.
Boy, Ben just rushes right in and starts dumping poison into the well, doesn't he? Literally within the first 5 seconds, he refers to philosophy arguments from 101, implying atheism is based on first-year philosophy arguments that a bunch of dorks were impressed by as freshmen, and that they're constantly trotted out, as if atheists just keep annoyingly repeating them by rote for no reason other than that they lack imagination and have never moved past them. But I wouldn't say this is a fair assessment. I mean, sure, we do find ourselves repeating a lot of the same arguments, but it's not because we just like to. It's because Christians keep proposing ideas that have the same glaring problems. When you do that, then, I'm sorry, you're going to keep hearing the same refutations. It's just the way it works. Your theology doesn't get grandfathered into legitimacy just because objections to its badly formed ideas start to sound repetitive. You have to actually, resolve those objections. But I guess that's the question at stake here. If Craig can debunk these arguments, as the title suggests, then they aren't necessary reactions to Christianity and are thus the pointless, obnoxious things Shapiro characterizes them as. If his debunking falls short, though, then Christianity still has unresolved issues that these objections speak to, regardless of whether Ben feels they get trotted out too often. So, let's see if Craig finally does what we've never seen him or any other apologist do in the past.
The most common one that I've heard, of course, is the problem of evil, the suggestion that how can God be good if so much evil takes place in the world? Yeah. The more sophisticated version of the argument to me is not the problem of human evil, which seems pretty easily disposable.
Probably not as disposable as it seems to Ben. Whenever I hear people distinguish between the problems of human and natural evil, it's usually on the grounds that human evil is less problematic because it can be answered by free will. This justification is dumb almost to the point of being a non sequitur. I mean, if free will isn't a good reason for a police officer to stand by and watch a crime, then it's even less reason for God to, right? And while Ben didn't give this or any other reason for why this argument is pretty easily disposable, this doesn't bode well for his estimation of when an atheist argument has been debunked.
But the problem of natural evil things happening to children, a child with cancer, how does a good God rule over a world in which children die of natural causes, in which kids are born with Tay-Sachs, in which horrible things happen to good people?
Yes. In dealing with this problem, I think it's really important that we distinguish between what I call the intellectual problem of evil and the emotional problem of evil. There is no doubt that emotionally, the evil and suffering in the world make it very difficult to believe in God. It's a tremendous emotional obstacle. But intellectually, considered dispassionately as a philosophical problem, it's extraordinarily difficult to show that there's either any inconsistency or improbability between the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God and the evil and suffering in the world.
This is a weird comment for Craig to make. Sure, the patronizing insinuation that people who raise this issue are just reacting out of emotion is pretty on brand for him, even delivered with his usual smile and hint of a chuckle, but I'm not so sure you can totally divorce emotion from a problem like this. I mean, sure, you should do your best to keep your thinking logical, but even reasonable reactions to atrocities are going to be influenced by some kind of often strong emotion. If you could somehow fully remove emotion from the process, your judgment would be devoid of care for people's well-being, and then who knows what kind of coldly logical or potentially horrible decisions would come out of your robot brain. Besides, this is a totally hypocritical standard for him to hold us to, as many of his arguments are just filthy with premises grounded in emotion. Take the key premise of his moral argument: objective moral values and duties exist. How does he establish this? In any interaction I've seen, he more or less appeals to our feeling that it's true, and in many of his rehearsed debate routines, he validates it with nothing more than, deep down, you know it's true. Forget the fact that intellectually considered as a philosophical problem, to borrow the phrasing he just used. There's no inconsistency between what he calls subjective morality and the universe as we see it. He apparently still gets to build entire lines of reasoning on an allusion to a gut-level instinct generated largely by our emotional reaction to certain behaviors. But why isn't this good enough for our arguments? Why can't we just appeal to people's sense that God's behavior as depicted in the Bible is wrong and deep down you know it? Now, I'm not a fan of whataboutism, but we really can't let Craig get away with setting up such an uneven playing field that he can just breeze by with appeals to emotion or intuition. But if we can't utterly falsify one of his positions using dot-to-dot, line-by-line, mathematically precise reasoning that doesn't give him the tiniest bit of space to wriggle out using semantics, then he gives us the old patronizing smile and laugh because we're philosophical amateurs. And I didn't even touch on his material that forgoes argument for the sake of emotional appeal to how meaningless life would be without God. But enough of that. Let's move on and see if he can actually show us how empty the problem of evil is.
The atheist would have to show that it is either impossible or improbable that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the natural and moral evil in the world. And how could he possibly show that? We're simply not in a position to make those kind of probability judgments with any confidence. And so I think that the problem of evil, as difficult as it may be emotionally, intellectually, it lays a burden of proof on the shoulders of the atheist, which is so heavy that it has proved to be unsustainable.
What Craig did here is pretty interesting. It kind of has the feel of a compelling point to it, and I can see how it might throw you back on your heels and make you feel like you've taken on a huge burden of proof. After all, how could you ever demonstrate that a massively intelligent, timeless, all-knowing God doesn't have reasons for allowing suffering? In fact, such a God could have reasons for literally anything, and it might just be beyond your puny human comprehension, right? But before you let someone try telling you you have the burden of proof, stop and ask yourself, what point am I trying to make? Because that's up to you to decide. Are you trying to prove that a Christian can't construct an internally consistent narrative about a God who does things that make no apparent sense to us because his ways are above ours? Or are you just evaluating whether a narrative seems to be a compelling description of reality? I can tell you right now that it's basically impossible for you to do option 1. And that's not because Craig made a compelling point. It's just because his narrative was designed with safeguards meant to protect against falsifiability. This is the easiest thing in the world to do. To illustrate, imagine someone, we'll call him Bob, told you aliens were visiting Earth in flying saucers. You might ask, naturally, where all these flying saucers are. But in response, he just retorts that the aliens don't want to be spotted, and because they have unimaginable stealth technology and are amazing at picking up after themselves, there's no sign of them visiting Earth. You can probably recognize what happened, right? Since he had no shred of evidence for his claim, Bob just concocted a narrative designed to accommodate his lack of evidence. Now, you can't prove it's impossible that aliens have this kind of stealth capability, right? Sure, fine. But is the burden on you to do so? Does it at all matter if you do so? Of course not. Anybody with moderate creativity can invent that kind of narrative and tie up all the loose ends as they go since, they get to make up the details. And since all Bob's story does is explain aliens in such a way that a universe with them looks exactly like a universe without them, the internal viability of his invented story is of no consequence to you. He's just being evasive, and his theory, almost by design, has no explanatory or predictive power. That's all Craig is doing here. Just like Bob, Bill proposes a paranormal phenomenon with certain traits. Just as you ask Bob why there are no signs of aliens on Earth, you might ask Bill why there are no signs of anybody intervening to stop evil the way you'd hope a triomni God would. And just as Bob says, well, it's because the aliens I can't show you have stealth technology, Bill says, well, it's because the God I can't show you has reasons beyond your understanding. So yeah, I guess Craig knows how to weave an airtight story. Good for him. But the fact that people can't methodically tear down the internal consistency of that story doesn't mean their arguments aren't logical, and it certainly doesn't mean they can be dismissed as emotional. It just means they know better than to care about the internal logic of a story that does nothing more than give reason why a triomni God might possibly hypothetically exist in a universe that doesn't give any sign of its existence.
And these days, the other argument that is brought up an enormous amount is the supposed backwardness of the Bible itself and biblical morality. This happens largely with regard to, for example, homosexual marriage. It's been brought up with regard to abortion, which I think is more, again, easily disposable, because I think there's a solid secular argument in favor of the protection of human life.
Also disposable because the Bible never prohibits it.
But homosexual marriage is the one that most often comes up. You also hear arguments that the Bible permits slavery. So if the Bible is so wonderful, then why are there all these weird sections of the Bible where it talks about wiping peoples from the earth, where it talks about enslaving other human beings? Some things that we would certainly consider moral evils today are contemplated by the Bible and not banned by the Bible. So why is that?
The most parsimonious answer is that the writers of the Bible had way different values than we do, and thus their writings don't reflect the nature of God in a way that feels comfortable to modern Christians. I mean, I think that's the way we'd approach most writings. You know, take them at their word as meaning what they say they mean. But I bet Craig comes up with another answer.
Well, let me address briefly first this question of slavery. When we hear the word slavery, Ben, we think of slavery as it existed in the American South. And as you know, that is nothing like the system that existed in ancient Israel. In ancient Israel, there was no social safety net sponsored by the state. There was no poverty program. So if a man got himself into a situation where he couldn't pay his debts, he could keep his family together and retain his self-respect by selling himself as an indentured servant to his creditor until he could work off his debts, and then he would have to be set free. After 7 years, he had to be set free in any case. So this was really a form of indentured servanthood. It wasn't slavery as we think of that term. This was actually an anti-poverty program.
There's a ton wrong with this, but I don't want to take a lot of time dissecting it. Let's just be clear that if slavery were intended to be some form of humane debt settlement program, the Bible would have said as much. The fact that this justification was never put into words until it was needed by modern apologists who find slavery more appalling than the Bible's authors did sums up a lot of the story here, regardless of how good the justifications themselves are. And, you know, they're not good anyway. Like, incredibly, desperately not good.
And in some respects, I think it's better than what we have in modern Western culture.
Well, that's a pretty hot take. Pause if you need to and consider what it would look like if Craig were actually proposing this idea instead of just using it as a way to resolve cognitive dissonance.
Which destroys families, ruins people's self-respect because they're not working. Whereas in ancient Israel, a man retained his self-respect, he worked for an income, he paid his debts, he kept his family together.
So when someone gets into debt, the options are 7 years of involuntary servitude or not working at all, and if you choose a second one, your family breaks apart. Something about that seems totally incorrect.
And that, to call that slavery is just a gross misrepresentation.
Okay, so to make this really simple, let's set aside all other considerations and grant that, fine, Craig is absolutely right about this. Calling this slavery is a gross misrepresentation. That still leaves us with the plain fact that the Bible contains both the rules whereby a Hebrew can press another Hebrew into indentured servitude, and a whole other set of laws whereby a Hebrew can buy a non-Hebrew and keep them as property for life. And all Craig did is argue that the first one, horrifying as it is, isn't slavery, and flatly pretend the second one, you know, the one with actual literal chattel slavery that the Bible itself describes as so harsh you're not supposed to do it to other Israelites, just isn't in there. This is such an inadequate and dishonest way of handling the problem that there's simply no reason to expound upon it. What I find interesting is the contrast between how he handles slavery and how he's going to handle homosexuality.
Now, the first thing you mentioned, I've forgotten.
Homosexual marriage, same-sex marriage.
With respect to some of these other moral questions, I think we need to remember the first premise of the moral argument. If there is no God, then there are no objective moral values and duties. Everything is socioculturally relative.
We can remember that premise, but for Craig's sake, it would be best if we didn't. You know, because it sucks.
So who's to say that the moral values of a society that discriminates against people and oppresses people is worse than one which is liberal and tolerant?
Who's to say that everybody being on fire is worse than everybody getting free ice cream? Some things are just manifestly evident to anybody who values humans' experience and isn't being philosophically pedantic to make an otherwise untenable point.
We just sort of assume that the liberal values are the ones that would be objective, when in fact they're just as relativistic as any of the other ones on atheism.
Objective versus subjective are weird words for describing morality, and your obligation to another person can be just as objective as your obligation to God, and I get tired of re-explaining this. So look for my list of videos about morality in the description, and let's move on.
So if we need God to be the anchor point for objective moral values and duties,
if,
we cannot escape the question, when thinking of moral right and wrong, well, what does God think of this? And if God proscribes something, it seems to me that's entirely within his right. If God were to say, thou shalt not eat beans, or thou shalt not eat pork, that would be our moral duty, and we should obey it. That is his prerogative as the moral lawgiver and the supreme good.
It's pretty obvious that this is a bizarre thing for Craig to say, right? But why is it strange? Because these commands are arbitrary. And why are they arbitrary? The main thing it boils down to is they do nothing to prevent harm or improve people's lives. In fact, it can be argued they make people's lives worse, though very slightly, by denying them a dietary preference for no good reason. I'm sure Craig actually chose these rules because they were arbitrary to make the point that God can define morality however he wants. However, he played his cards a little too freely by drawing too much attention to something. Morality defined as the commands of God and morality defined as guidelines designed to prevent harm by helping people live together in a safe, cohesive society are two different things. Now, Craig can insist that the actual word morality applies to the first one, but that's inconsequential and only establishes what we mean by a specific utterance. Regardless of which you mean when you say morality, both ideas exist. You need to contend with both and either reconcile them or, if you can't, choose which is more important when they come into conflict. For example, God prohibits murder, except in certain Old Testament contexts, of course, and murder also causes harm to people and would cause society to become unraveled if allowed to run rampant. So these two ideas align on this topic. Easy enough. But what if God wanted everybody to murder as much as possible? That's where it gets a little hairy. Craig could use the word moral to describe murder, but we'd still be left with the fact that it causes horrifying harm to people, so we'd have to choose. Which do we value more? Preventing harm or making sure that a being defined as God gets obeyed? You'd have to have something seriously wrong with you to choose the second. I think that's why Craig chose beans and pork instead of murder to show that God should be obeyed no matter what. You can smile and shuffle your way past an arbitrary divine command, but a horrifying divine command makes the problem with Craig's whole idea just way too obvious. This tells us a lot about the final point Craig ends up making.
And so if God says, my plan for human sexuality is heterosexual marriage, that's his prerogative. And there is no basis for calling that, I think, into question.
Notice the ease with which Craig just kind of throws a suggestion out there. I mean, this is not a small thing. He's literally talking about dissolving people's long-term loving relationships, yet he treats it with a casual detachment of someone solving a Rubik's Cube. And as long as he can get the semantic pieces to line up in some plausibly satisfying way, who the cares about the real-world impact? He feels like his theology makes sense, or can cash checks from people who do, and that's good enough for him because he's not affected by it. It's other people's marriages that get broken up. And let's remember, the idea of what God wants is purely hypothetical, ethereal conjecture. What we're actually dealing with is people positioning themselves to tell other people what God wants. If someone came up to Craig and said, God told me you shouldn't be married to your wife anymore, he'd tell them to f*** off. So if he had sufficient self-awareness, combined with a shred of decency of course, something inside his head should tell him to f*** off before any version of the same thing directed at anybody else escaped his mouth. People running around telling each other what this God or that God supposedly wants is always going to be a chaotic, self-serving, and often abusive dynamic that can only possibly produce good ideas by accident. But there's something interesting in what Craig did here, because his acceptance of a command against homosexuality is not as simple as commands from God are absolute. If it were, then the justification would work across the board. God allows slavery? Well, that's his prerogative and there's no basis for calling that into question. God prohibits homosexuality? Well, that's his prerogative and there's no basis for calling that into question. But that's obviously not what he did, and his vastly different reaction to two clear divine commands, neither of which, by the way, was ever retracted at any point in Scripture, suggests that there's something else going on here. That his reactions to these issues are not entirely or even primarily driven by Scripture, but by his and his audience's own internal feelings on each one. It's easy for him to give this textbook answer about homosexuality. He probably at best gives zero fucks about the LGBTQ community and is speaking to an audience that is generally prejudiced against it. So reducing it to a preference on par with beans or pork and saying, well, if God says don't do it, is pretty easy for him. But this doesn't go down quite so easy with slavery. The Christians he's talking to live in the 21st century, not the 19th, so this is going to be a bridge too far for them. He knows he can't reconcile the idea of divine commands with something they find this horrible, so instead he does something really weird. He just flatly lies about the Bible's stance on slavery, knowing his audience will probably join him in looking the other way. And let's be clear, he is lying. Unless he's unfamiliar with the Bible to an extent that's criminal given his profession, he knows the Bible allows chattel slavery and is just pretending it doesn't. This brings us back to our core question. Did Craig debunk the best atheist arguments? It sure doesn't seem like it. All he did was rattle off some standard superficial lines about the problem of evil, grossly misrepresent how the burden of proof works, and assert that divine commands are absolute even though they only come from people and Craig won't consistently stand behind them anyway. So, no, atheism hasn't been debunked, and he and Shapiro probably just got paid way too much to repeat some incredibly basic, ultimately empty apologetics. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Daniel Bostet, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.